Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to change the pace a little bit. So I'm going to be talking about some modelling work I've been doing with colleagues at RMIT University in Melbourne, looking at evaluating biodiversity offset policies. And I guess I'm going to come back and think about it a bit more from a theoretical perspective rather than the sort of very interesting practical perspectives we've been hearing about in the previous talks. So I just want to start a little bit about just framing how we might think about this a bit more from a theoretical perspective. So if we have some location and we have some biodiversity at that location, we can quantify that with some sort of metric or surrogate, and of course there's huge debates about what are the appropriate metrics or surrogates to use and how well do they really represent what we want to capture with our term, quote, biodiversity. But in any case, I'm sort of visualising maybe some metric of vegetation condition or ecological condition, which is commonly used in Australia. And we have some starting value of that biodiversity, and we can assume, as is the case in a lot of locations in Australia, it's declining over time. We can have a development occurring at some time T1, and the biodiversity at that location we assume goes to 0. And so at the time T1, we can say the impact or the loss attributable to the development is shown in the blue bar. But interestingly, if we assume the biodiversity is declining over time, then at some future point, the loss due to the development may actually be smaller. And we can think about then some offset that's implemented to try and compensate for that development. Ideally, it should be the same biodiversity. And so we have an initial biodiversity value at some time, the offset is implemented, and then we can think about our counterfactual, or what would have happened without the offset. And if we assume that the biodiversity would have just remained constant, then we have a gain attributable to the offset shown by that blue bar. But likewise, we could also assume that without the offset, that the biodiversity would have been declining at that offset site in the same way as at the development site. And therefore, we have a different counterfactual, and therefore the gain attributable to our offset is actually much greater. And so initially that might seem great because our offset's actually delivering a bigger gain. But in reality, what that means is that offset can actually be used to compensate for a greater amount of development losses. And in reality, the actual outcome is no different. We can also say, well, it's actually quite likely that if that offset wasn't implemented, that vegetation would have been cleared at some time. And so we can have a third counterfactual saying not only would we have the vegetation declining, it may have been lost, and in which case that gives us an even bigger estimate of gain attributable to the offset and allows that offset to actually compensate for a much greater amount of development loss. And so if we have this objective of biodiversity offsets achieving no net loss of biodiversity, then really this gain from the offset needs to compensate the loss from the development, and how we measure those gains and losses is absolutely crucial. So we can think about this as sort of maybe the restoration gain that the offset's delivering. This is avoided condition decline if we're thinking in the world of vegetation condition sort of metrics, and this is then avoiding clearing or some sort of catastrophic loss. And so when we think about the impacts of development losses and offset gains, to determine whether no net loss is achieved, we need the net impact of the combined interventions to be greater than 0, so the negative loss from the development plus the positive gain from the offset. But really, if we're adding those two things together, the losses and the gains actually need to be commensurate. Otherwise, it's sort of like adding apples and oranges. And so, we really need to calculate the losses and the gains in a consistent way. Otherwise, in some sense, it's sort of meaningless to talk about no net loss. And perhaps, in many cases, actually, framing it as no net loss is somewhat meaningless, and we really should just be going back to thinking about it as some sort of more qualitative compensation. And I guess that can be something we can raise in the discussion later. The other point I wanted to raise that's come out in this modelling is when we think about evaluating are offsets delivering no net loss, the scale at which we evaluate is actually really important. So if we have a development shown here in orange and the offset shown here in green, we can sort of evaluate on just what I call the site scale, or could be called the project scale, where we have just the development and the offset location, and we consider those in isolation and think about if and when no net loss ever occurs. We can also evaluate more on the program scale, where we can look at the cumulative set of locations over multiple developments and multiple offsets and think about to what extent that achieves no net loss. And then we can also think about the landscape scale, which is the whole area over which the policy functions, the offset policy functions, including all the locations that actually aren't developed or offset. And the results of the evaluation at different scales can be completely different, as I'll briefly show you. So we're exploring this with some software we've developed which we call Offset Sim. It's developed in the statistical programming language R. It's open source. It's available on GitHub. I'm not really going to be able to talk about it in any detail here, but one of the crucial points is it allows you to simulate ecological dynamics, and at the moment we're just looking at it as modelling change in vegetation conditions type metrics, and so you can parameterise how it changes under sort of do-nothing scenarios versus how it might improve under management as an offset. The software allows you to then simulate development, offsets in response to that development, and try and evaluate the performance. So I'll just show you quickly some simulated results, and then also a brief example of where we've applied this to a real-world case study in Sydney. So for this simulated example, there's 2,500 parcels. We initialise it with some initial condition, and we assume the vegetation condition is declining through time. We then have some logistic model of improvement if it starts being managed as an offset. And so then we can just loop over 50 years, and every year we have a number of parcels developed such that we have 250 developments in total. In each case, the model calculates the impact relative to what counterfactual you specify, and you can specify different ones. It then searches for offsets that deliver appropriate gains relative to your specified counterfactual within a specified time horizon and implements the offsets, and that's repeated. And I'll just quickly show you. So for example, this is, oops, I'm skipping forward. Okay, so on the left here, this is the outcomes. So you can see the red one represents a site that had some initial biodiversity value. It's developed, it goes to zero. I've got a pointer here. And here we have an offset that you can't really see was declining, it's managed, and this offset is meant to accrue gains in 30 years. So at some point, the management stops once an improvement reaches a certain level, and it's just maintained. And so basically what we see here is this is the outcomes, whereas the impact or the change attributable to the actions, the development initially has no impact, it then goes to zero and remains zero. The offset impact is zero, it starts to deliver gains, and then as the management stops, the gains reduce, but they still increase because we've got ongoing avoided loss gains. And so this is a little cartoon of the counterfactual used to measure the offset gain. So we're having the avoided loss and the restoration gain. And so this is just the site scale, just the development and the offset. And so in this case, the model assumes that it does indeed achieve no net loss in the requisite time frame. If we then look at the program scale, this red line shows the cumulative, so this is just the impact, so the difference of the development in red, the cumulative gains from the offset in green, and the sum of the two. And so the interesting thing that sort of you notice is that even though at the site scale every offset's achieving no net loss and potentially better within 30 years, at the program scale we're not even achieving no net loss in 50 years because we've got ongoing developments and we've got these ongoing time lapse. And so yeah, no net loss at one scale doesn't necessarily mean it's achieved at another scale. And then at the landscape scale, we can also include all the other parcels that aren't actually developed or offset, and we can see we're getting big losses in the landscape. And in this case, I removed the avoided loss component, and we're just using restoration gains, and this means the offsets deliver smaller gains, and you need more offsets per development as well. If we include avoided loss, this actually gets much worse because the offsets are delivering more gain per offset. And just to finish off, I'll quickly show you we've been doing some work in to the west of Sydney here on the Cumberland Plain woodland. There's a whole lot of urban development being planned into new proposed growth areas. And I can't actually show you any maps of the priority growth areas, development and offset locations, because this is still being assessed and it's somewhat sensitive, but I have been given permission to show you some of the outcomes. And so what we did is we did a big expert elicitation process for a particular critically endangered woodland that is prevalent through Western Sydney, and got the experts to parameterise a model and give us their estimates of how its condition is likely to change under sort of do nothing or ongoing typical private land threats, and then also how it's likely to improve under a couple of different management scenarios. And so given this, we could then play out the realistic proposed development scenarios of loss of this woodland, and also play out different scenarios that are proposed for offsets, both in the location and how they're managed and when they're implemented. And so I'll just end by showing, so this is the landscape outcomes. So you can see the black line is sort of do nothing. So we start at a given point here. And so this is the sum of the vegetation condition over the whole landscape, including the developed areas, the offset areas, and the areas that aren't affected by either. And so the black line is sort of showing us do nothing. If there's no development or no offsetting, we just expect some ongoing decline. The red line is showing if we have development only, things are worse. And then the other colours show different scenarios of implementing offsets at different times with different management. And we can swap then to looking at the actual impact or changes attributable to the development and offset. And again, you can see now the do nothing is flat, because that's our baseline that we're looking at relative to. We can see development only gives us a big negative result. But here in this case, 3 of the offset scenarios we can see are delivering what look like a net gain over the 37 years of the project. And one of them is delivering a net loss here. And so that sort of looks good at the one scale, but at the other we can see that all of them are still giving us a net loss relative to where we are now, except for the one scenario that is highly optimistic and probably completely infeasible to actually implement. But it shows the absolute best that could be done. But you know, the actual losses aren't, they vary, you know, depending on the scenario. So I don't really have time to talk any more about that, but you know, just to note that in the real world, I'm aware that offsetting is actually determined via a messy sort of process of negotiation, deliberation, and isn't, you know, worked out with sort of clear quantitative metrics as modelled here. But you know, we can still use these approaches to explore evaluating at different scales with different types of policies. And you know, this thing about estimating counterfactuals is tricky, but I feel like it's completely critical, because you know, we're talking about the impact or the change attributable to the offset and the development. And to be able to do that, the counterfactual is absolutely vital, because the actual outcome by itself can be meaningless. You know, if the vegetation condition declines at an offset site, it doesn't necessarily mean the offset failed. It might have declined more without the offset, or it might not. You know, until you think about the counterfactual, you don't really know. So I'll end there, and thanks very much